So when we talk about a carbon market, what we're really talking about is legal frameworks that put an obligation on people to restrict their emissions of carbon. And the sort of people you're targeting are clearly the very large emitters, large power companies, industrials. But over time, the idea is to cover as much of the economy you can. And what these schemes really do is they either give somebody a permit or an allowance that say you can emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. And there's an issue here about whether you have to buy that permit or whether you get that permit for free. And that is going to be a very big issue in Australia, particularly, for example, in the electricity privatisations where someone's buying an asset. And the question is, we don't know what the federal obligation is, and are they going to get a free allocation of permits or are they going to have to pay for them, which affects the value of the business. There's also the ability to create offsets. So if someone does a project which reduces emissions, then those offsets can be traded into those schemes. And what these global carbon markets do, and this trading's going on today, is people buy and sell these permits or allowances and these offsets. And in addition to that, as I mentioned before, there's also people who are doing projects which are not under any regulatory regime, whereby they're creating voluntary carbon and trading that as well. And so at the moment, the heart of this global trading market is the European Emissions Trading Scheme. Because people have an obligation to reduce carbon, they have to buy offsets and they have to buy allowances. And that has driven this global market in carbon, which is particularly active today. And sitting in Australia, we're not exposed to that market, but we are about to be exposed to it. And I think as Anthony will talk, one of the key principles is how does the Australian market link into that global market going forward. And the other interesting thing about this market is that it's producing this new commodity called carbon. And a tonne of carbon is not the same as a tonne of carbon. They are different. We have carbon, for example, under the New South Wales trading scheme, which is different to allowances under the European scheme, which is different to CDM carbon, and it's all priced differently and the commodity is different in different markets. So to give you an example, voluntary carbon is probably the most price volatile, where prices range from $3 to $4 up to $28. We also have EU allowances, which this morning we're trading at around €18 for the spot price, up to 22 for longer term. And we have a whole sort of divergence, sort of offset carbon produced in China, which complies in that European market, at the moment is selling around 10, 12 euros. So we have a different commodity here that's emerged in this sort of global trading market. And the point I made at the outset about these markets respond to legal changes is particularly important. This is a graph of the New South Wales electricity trading scheme. And the New South Wales government has had, the New South Wales greenhouse gas abatement scheme. The New South Wales government has had a scheme in place for some time about trading carbon, and they announced over a year ago that the scheme would run to 2020, subject only to no federal scheme coming into place. And if a federal scheme came into place, they would look at it. The price was sort of hovering around the compliance, around the penalty price, which is around $14, and the price was fairly stable over the life of the market. Then in August last year, and I'm just going to focus here more on issues about energy efficiency. There was a group of people in the market who produce energy efficiency credits, which are when people come to your house, install a light bulb, and in return for that, they get a carbon credit from IPART, from the New South Wales government, and they sell that credit. The government adjusted one of the regulations about the amount of carbon you could get, and as a result of that was that in August 2006, there was an immediate drop in price, because rather than automatically getting 10 credits for handing out a pack of light bulbs, you had to go and install them in the house. In 2007, the Prime Minister, in July 2007, the Prime Minister announced that we were going to look at having a climate change policy in Australia with a long-term target and have an emissions trading scheme. The result of that was the market suddenly dropped because people thought, well, maybe this market isn't going to go for so long. In May 2007, there was the report on emissions trading, which set the time agenda a bit more clearly, and the price dropped again. And there was ongoing policy statements, which came to a point that the confidence in the market was sort of shaken. And as a result of that, a lot of people bid the price down aggressively. And there's now continued uncertainty as to how long the scheme will go for, what will happen. And the government's responded to that by trying to put some policy statements out. But I think the point is that as we go forward in Australia in developing this market, all these carbon markets do very much build upon legislation and build upon policy. What's particularly interesting is that all of the scientists at the moment are saying that in order to stabilise emissions, we have to get to a 60% reduction by 2050 Stern talks possibly up to 80%. Yet where we are in terms of regulation at the moment is a long, long way away from that. So there's a very big gap against where we have to be and where we are. And that'll only be filled in two ways. One, through technology breakthroughs, through having significant technology that reduces emissions, and two, through forcing more obligations to invest in renewables to reduce emissions. So it's just part of the fact that we're really, again, at the start of this market, which is really on the edge of taking off. So I just want to talk a little bit in the second half about what we've seen internationally about the business of climate change and what business has been doing globally, and maybe what we can expect in Australia. As the markets developed in Europe, the market started off very early in the 90s. We saw the main players were the multilateral banks. People like the World Bank came in and said, look, this market's very mature. We think that we can come in and create some funds. We can buy carbon. And in effect, they went into the market and found projects that reduced carbon, took legal ownership to them well before any legal right or any statute existed to create that. So they took a very large, significant punt on that carbon, ended up buying a lot of it for anything from 50 cents to $4. And you think it's now trading more at €14. It was not actually a bad play. So they sort of drove the market very early on, and a lot of national governments invested in those funds, as did Japanese utilities, and they sort of came to the market. We then saw a lot of small boutique consultants come around, companies like EcoSecurities, companies like Camco and others emerge on the market, who were small companies who went into a lot of developing countries to develop renewable energy and other projects to generate carbon. A lot of those companies have gone on to raise money to list on the AIM exchange, and their whole business is based around carbon credits, and their value is based on carbon credits. So as the market's been hit recently with things like delays in credits being produced, inaccurate verifications, it has actually hit the share price. But it's been interesting that a lot of these companies who are now fairly active are looking at setting up in Australia and seeing Australia as a base to go into the Asian market. There's a lot of traders in the market. We then saw some niche investment players come in, like boutique banks like Climate Change Capital. A lot of compliance buyers have come in, and as I said before, once the scheme comes in, once a trading scheme comes in, then all of industry comes into play and start buying and starts investing in funds. And then more recently, we've seen a lot of carbon funds emerge, hedge funds be very active, and the investment banks are becoming far more active. A lot of the investment banks sort of waited to see what would happen in the market and have taken positions in a lot of the companies that are around today. So the market's sort of evolved. I think in the Australian case, we will jump very quickly into see a lot of the investment banks and the compliance buyers come in immediately. And just to give you an example, many of you probably know who AES is. It's one of the largest power companies in the United States. AES, although the project developers started off being these small-scale companies, AES is now a major player in this area in terms of developing globally carbon offset projects. GE, you know about, who have got Eco-Imagination. Again, two of the largest companies in the US have just formed a joint venture called GE AES Greenhouse Gas Services. So we have a very significant global player here to go in. Their attitude is that the US market is going to take off very, very quickly, and that by positioning themselves to do a lot of projects early, they can generate a lot of the supply that the US market needs. What we've seen also is this phenomenal growth in carbon funds, where people, Australia, there's been a lot of growth in infrastructure funds, property funds, etc. But globally, we've seen a significant growth in carbon funds. Now, I think at the moment, up to about 80 funds. And these funds do really one of three things. Traditionally, they've invested in carbon because investors in the fund want you to go out and buy carbon and deliver it to them. Secondly, a lot of them just simply invest in carbon and trade it and provide a financial return. And increasingly, as the market becomes more competitive for these funds to buy the carbon, they're getting more into equity investment and finding projects that are a good equity play but also produce carbon as well.